Seasoned mom with flair, crafter who cares, writer of tales with dolls in her lair, with stitches so fine, a wit so divine. Her humor is twisted as grape on the vine, attracting the strange, confessions arranged. Her life is a mix that's delightfully deranged. Rachel makes it weird.
Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of my podcast, Rachel Makes It Weird. Today we're going to be talking about making it weird Disney style. One thing to know about me is that I flippin' love Disney World. We've been annual pass holders since we moved to Florida 6 or 7 years ago. We've probably been there 100 times, and we know the shortcuts and money-saving tricks and how to avoid the longest wait times. I have a shockingly bad sense of direction, but I can get you anywhere you want to go in any of the parks. So obviously there must be something about Disney World to keep us coming back over and over. These are a few of my favorite things. 1. There's always something new to see, either a new attraction or something that's been there since the park opened that you just never noticed before. The Imagineers have packed so many details and hidden gems into this place. I don't think I'll ever discover everything that there is to discover there. 2. I love interactions with random people. On a recent visit, a little girl waved at me from the People Mover, and I waved back. She yelled, "Woohoo!" at me, and I yelled, "Woohoo!" right back, and we just waved and smiled until she was out of sight. We were total strangers, and it felt like we'd known each other a year. 3. The freedom to be silly. I love to do a lot of silly walking and dancing when I'm there. I just can't help it. Sometimes my kids hold my hands and join me. Sometimes they slink away in shame. Either way, I have a blast. 4. It's a great way to connect with my kids, especially my son. Silas is autistic, and like a lot of kids on the spectrum, Disney is his love language. He's memorized a lot of the movies, and we've sometimes referenced them to help us communicate with him. Being at the park, seeing the characters he loves, feels like home for him. 5. The cast members. From the street sweepers to the ride controllers to the characters, everyone is uber professional and friendly there. Once in a while, at the end of a long day, you might see an exhausted cast member who looks just a little bit jaded, but for the most part, everyone who works there just seems like people. I think being an extrovert must be a prerequisite for working there. I'm an extrovert, and I find being around the friendly cast members truly energizing. I could talk to them and distract them from their jobs all day long. Once we were chatting with the Dumbo ride operators just before the fireworks, and they let us stay on the ride for twice as long to enjoy the fireworks from that amazing vantage point. But more than anything, my favorite thing to do is people watch. As we walk in, I look around for people who are obviously there for the first time. I love to watch parents watch their kids' faces light up when they catch their first glimpse of Cinderella Castle. The parents look at each other, and their eyes well up with tears, and then my eyes well up with tears, and then I have to hold on to my husband so I don't run into things until I've stopped being emotional. The best thing is when multiple generations come. You've got the grandparents, their grown-up daughter and son-in-law, and 2 or 3 squirrely kids. And you can just tell by the satisfied look on the grandparents' faces that they probably paid for the tickets and made all this possible. And then when the kids see the castle or Mickey Mouse and start jumping up and down, and their parents are trying to corral them, the grandparents just look at each other. You can almost see the pride exploding in their chests. They made this happen for their family. They got all their favorite people in one place, and they are giving them the most magical day of their lives. Of course, they're all going to be feeling a bit differently at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when everyone's hangry and They had to postpone lunch to wait in line, and the baby's missing her nap, and little Johnny wet his pants. But in that brief, shimmering moment, their lives are perfect. I also love to watch people watch the fireworks show, Happily Ever After. It's got lasers and these really creative projections on the castle, and I'm blown away every time I see it. My favorite part is when the song You Are the Magic is playing, because that's when the moms and dads in the crowd often look down at their kids at the line, because you are the magic. And they're just beaming down, like, despite all the creative genius they've seen all day, there's nothing more magical in the whole world than their own beautiful children. I know that's what they must be thinking because they have the same look on their faces that my husband and I had when we watched the fireworks show with our kids the very first time, and that's what we were thinking. My husband and I also like to look at the older couples without their families walking around holding hands. We hope that'll be us someday when our kids have flown the nest. Usually we go with our kids and only get to enjoy being a couple for a few stolen minutes before someone complains about being thirsty or begs us to break our no buying souvenirs rule. But every once in a while, we leave them at home and go on a Disney date. Josh and I recently had a great date at the Magic Kingdom. We bought special tickets for after hours, which went from 9 to 1 a.m. So there were a lot fewer people in the park and the lines were all relatively short. We went on all the rides we wanted to and even got to sit next to each other for a change. The evening went by without any problems until it was time to leave. To exit the park, you can either take the ferry boat or the monorail to the parking lot. It looked like there was a long line for the monorail, so we took the ferry boat. It was standing room only, which isn't unusual for the end of the night. Now, I had a strange feeling of being watched on the ferry boat. I chalked it up to someone looking at me because I looked familiar. As my husband says, there are only so many faces to go around. If you're in a big enough crowd, you're sure to see someone who looks just like someone else you know. I've caught myself making other people uncomfortable, staring, trying to figure out if I know them from somewhere or not. So I looked around to see if anyone was watching me, but no one seemed to be. And even though I had a sort of creepy crawly feeling, I didn't think too much of it until it was time to disembark. As we walked down the gangplank, one of the crew members said to Josh in a low voice, "You've got a couple of guys watching you, buddy." Then he looked very seriously at me and said, "Watch your step," with more than the usual emphasis. Now, I very much appreciate that man seeing something and saying something. He could have just as easily noticed that something was off and just gone about his job and not gotten involved. It was good of him to warn us of potential danger. However, he spoke so quickly, and the flow of the crowd swept us away immediately afterwards, so there was no asking him who was watching us or finding out if we'd even really heard him correctly. In the 100 times we've gotten off that boat, none of the cast members have said anything other than "have a nice night" or "come back soon," that sort of thing. So it took us a moment to process that he'd said something entirely different. The crowd split in two, with one group heading for the heroes parking lot and the other heading towards villains. We parked in villains in the Scar section in row 422, so that's way out in no man's land, and we took the tram to the villains lot because it was too far to walk. Josh and I are craning our necks every which way, looking around for potential danger. Suddenly, it seemed like there were groups of two guys everywhere around us, and they all seemed menacing. And so we got on the tram, and most of those groups of two guys are gone. I notice two men who were maybe in their 60s getting onto the tram a few seats behind us. They have very similar haircuts that looked fresh and were dressed in a very nondescript way in polo shirts and slacks. They weren't remotely physically intimidating, and they looked like they worked desk jobs. They were pale and drooping and honestly looked kind of anemic. They did not look like a threat. They looked like they were out way past their bedtime. I'd noticed them earlier in the day, I think because they seemed very blah. They didn't have the happy, excited, overwhelmed, or exhausted energy most people have at the parks. They were just neutral, and their very blandness made me notice them, oddly enough. I also observed a couple of young and fit guys get into the tram with us, and I wondered if they might have been the watchers, but they were giving off a happy, silly vibe and seemed harmless as puppies. I decided that whoever had been watching us, if anyone even had been, we were starting to wonder if the crew member had just been messing with us, had parked closer to the dock or gotten on the tram to the Heroes parking lot, and we probably didn't have to worry about them anymore. We began walking to our car, and the closer we got to the car, the more the crowd thinned out. Soon there was just one or two tired looking families nearby, and the two anemic looking men I'd noticed before. The families drifted away from us and found their cars, but the gray haired men took on a burst of energy and began rapidly closing the gap between us. Now, it's an enormous parking lot. There was no reason for them to get close to us. I felt like they were just deliberately zeroing in on us. They were almost close enough to reach out and grab my little Loungefly backpack if they wanted to. I wondered if they were going to mug us, and I realized we could absolutely take them if they tried. I mean, my husband has kind of a dad bod, but he's really strong. He also has a second-degree black belt in Shotokan karate and works out almost every morning. I'm in average shape for a woman my age, and while I'm a far cry from buff, I am about 5'10" and almost as tall as these guys, and I'm younger than them. I'm sizing them up and thinking I could run faster and kick harder. We wouldn't be easy targets, so I wondered if maybe they had something more strange and nefarious than a simple mugging in mind. I have a very big imagination and listen to true crime podcasts like Morbid, so my mind ran through some very dark possible scenarios. Maybe they had handkerchiefs soaked in chloroform and they were going to knock us out, kidnap us, and torture us later. Right when they were almost upon us. I mean, right behind us, just a couple steps. I turn my head to look at them and make sure they see me, see them, and then I loop my arm into my husband's and we walk/run to our car. It seemed that they immediately stopped following us as soon as they realized I knew they were following us. We got into our car, locked the doors, and watched them get into a silver sedan a couple rows over, not even anywhere near where we were parking, so again, why were they right on our tails? And we watched them drive away. And as we drove home, Josh and I kept looking around to see if we could see their car, and we're talking it over and wondering if that had all gone down the way we thought it had. Josh pointed out that we didn't look like obvious targets for mugging. I mean, we didn't have shopping bags or we weren't dressed particularly nice. So I suggested that maybe they were just dangerous sickos who got their jollies in other ways. Maybe they had been planning on doing something crazy like cutting off Josh's balls and stuffing them up his nostrils while I screamed. My husband didn't really like how quickly my mind went to that particular place. I hastened to assure him that if anyone tried to chop his balls off, I wouldn't stand by and I would fight and scream. I would fight and I would rip their balls off. My husband was somewhat comforted by my loyalty, but looked at me sideways and scooted further away. Um, that reminded us of a passage in the Bible, which we both thought of at the same time. Deuteronomy 25:11 through 12. If two men, a man and his countryman, have a fight with each other, and the wife of one comes up to save her husband from the hand of the one who is hitting him, and she reaches out with her hand and grasps that man's genitals, then you shall cut off her hand. Show her no pity. These verses bring up so many questions. Who wrote this rule? Did any woman actually ever lose a hand over this? This is an oddly specific scenario. I'm guessing it was written by a man who lost a fight because someone's wife grabbed him by the crotch. It sounds like the beginning of someone's villain arc, honestly. Jedediah was your typical wheat farmer having a typical run-of-the-mill fight with his neighbor Hezekiah, until out of nowhere came Hezekiah's wife grabbing Jedediah by the secrets with her grubby little hands. We may never know the origins of this verse. They'll just likely remain shrouded in mystery forever. Now, I was a preacher's kid, and Josh went to a private Christian school in the Bible Belt, so we both spent a lot of time memorizing scripture. The verses we were assigned were harmless, typically about loving God and making good choices. We definitely never had to memorize anything like Deuteronomy 25:11 through 12, but I tell you what, you come across a verse like that just once and it sticks with you for the rest of your life. So, just for fun, let's imagine that this Bible verse applied to my hypothetical modern day situation. What if these guys really had attacked my husband and I chose to defend him in that way? Would my hand get chopped off? Are there any loopholes? It says, if two men, a man and his countrymen, have a fight. So, what if it's two men against one man? Would it then be okay for me to grab one of them by the balls to make it a fair fight? Or how about this loophole? What if the guys attacking my husband weren't his countrymen? Could I get away with seizing men by the family jewels if they weren't U.S. citizens? What if they were Australian? I mean, it was dark and people from all over the world come to Disney World, and Australians look just like Americans. But what if I just thought they were Australians? Would I still get to keep my hand if, just before attacking, one of them said to my husband, "How you going, mate?" but they weren't really Australian and were actually U.S. citizens, and I made an honest mistake and grabbed them by the nuts? Would a judge still chop off my hand then? Or would he soften the sentence and just saw off a finger or two? I have so many questions. Luckily, we don't currently have Levitical laws in Florida. No one attacked my poor husband, and no one got grabbed in the gonads. And everyone got to keep their hands. All's well that ends well. Anywho, talking about our Magic Kingdom After Hours date reminds me of a really nice Disney date where my husband took me to dinner at Victoria and Albert's for our 10th wedding anniversary. Now, this is a Michelin-starred restaurant inside the fancy schmancy Grand Floridian Resort, and the dining experience can easily take 3 hours. The waiters bring you course after course, and the servings appear really tiny, but by the end of the night, you're too stuffed to move. Formal wear is expected, and Josh and I had fun getting all dressed up. It is obscenely expensive, so we saved money by staying at one of the value resorts and took a shuttle bus to the Grand Floridian. Someone on the bus, who was, like everyone else, hot and sweaty after a long day at the parks, asked where we were going all dressed up. When we told him we were going to Victoria and Albert's, he was surprised because he thought you had to stay at the Grand Floridian to dine there. And there we were, leaving a value resort in a bus full of stinky park-goers. I should add that even the value resorts aren't cheap, though they were definitely cheaper a few years ago. The prices have really gone up. My husband and I are the type who clip coupons and buy Christmas presents on Facebook Marketplace, so the whole evening was a really big splurge for us. Anyway, we had a magical time, and the food and service were incredible. I have a multitude of random food allergies that my husband told them about well in advance, so they had carefully customized a tasting menu just for me. There were little tiny mousses and dainty garnishes and whipped up confections that I don't remember the names of. I felt so pampered. So that was just a really fantastic date, and I recommend Victoria and Albert's very highly. Now, after our family spent a full day at the parks, we usually just drive back home, which is about an hour and a half away in good traffic. But once in a while, if it's really late and we're too tired, we might book a hotel. My husband is eagle eyed at spotting last minute deals for Florida residents. So one evening, my husband got us a room at one of Disney's all star value resorts for about half off, and we decided to walk around the boardwalk for a couple hours to play arcade games before going to bed. The Disney boardwalk is literally a boardwalk along the shores of Crescent Lake with turn of the century 20th century, Coney Island esque carnival type games, bars, shops, and restaurants. It even has a dance hall. It's just a fun place. Like Disney Springs, you don't need a ticket to the theme parks to go hang out there. It's free to get in, open to everyone. I wish we just lived a little closer because I'd be there all the time. So this evening, we're sitting outdoors at a table on the boardwalk, soaking up the atmosphere and eating ice cream. And there's this family sitting at another table nearby. They eye us for a while until they decide we're okay, and they start a conversation. Soon we're laughing and hitting it off, and then the mom mentions the name of the expensive boardwalk resort they're staying at and asks us where we're staying. We tell her we're at one of the value resorts. She and her husband just blink at us in a really surprised way. Then the mom says, very patronizingly, "Oh, then this must be a nice little adventure for you, then. Good night." You would think the temperature dropped about 30 degrees. um, these people's facial expressions are screaming, "I didn't know they let the poor people in here." She and her husband just gather up their kids and hustle them away from us, even though they weren't even done eating. They just wanted to get their impressionable progeny out of there before they caught whatever low class disease it was we were carrying. So yeah, I guess Disney does let anybody in, even the snobs. Okay, I just need to add that my family loves the value resorts, and even though we splurged one Christmas and stayed at a luxury resort, the Polynesian, our kids had a much better time at the cheaper one. The theming and overall vibe are much better for kids to run around and let off steam. Kids and their parents, honestly, seem to have a better time at the value resorts. So save your money and skip the fancy resorts until they're older, or skip it altogether. You will still have a great time. Those snooty people who are too good for us commoners makes me think of meeting royalty. Disney royalty. I really, really miss when my kids were little and wanted to meet the princesses. To them, it was so real. They were twirling with the Princess Snow White and discussing jazz music with the Princess Tiana and hoisting up Princess Ariel's skirt to see what she had on underneath. That was my son, Silas. He wanted to know if she had legs or a mermaid tail under her poofy hoop skirt. Fortunately, we saved Ariel before her skirt got past her knees, and we had a little talk with Silas about how to respect princesses and women in general. Speaking of respect, it's always been a bit jarring for me when kids are goggle eyed at meeting the princesses, and their parents act like they're taking orders at McDonald's. "Yo, Belle, can you hurry this up? We're supposed to meet our friends at the mine train in 5 minutes." I mean, how do they expect their kids to learn manners if they can't even take a few seconds to say hello, please, and thank you to a princess? Makes you wonder how they treat cashiers and waiters in other places if they can't even be polite at Disney. My husband and I always make a point to speak to the cast members as if they're royalty because to the kids they are. The little kids don't see college girls in wigs, makeup, and fancy dresses. They see the real Cinderella, who's always kind, and the real Mulan, who saved China, and the real Elena of Avalor, who did all those valiant things, and they're in awe. Once we splurged and booked a character dining lunch at the Animal Kingdom's Tusker House restaurant because we thought Silas and Zoe, who were then very small, would enjoy meeting Mickey Mouse and his pals. Silas did, but when Goofy came over, Zoe dove under the table and started trembling. When we asked her what the matter was, she said, "How do we know Goofy never killed a man?" Well, we couldn't answer that to my daughter's satisfaction, so she cowered under the table for the rest of the meal. She was never able to tell us why she was scared of Goofy. She saw Mickey and Minnie and Donald and Daisy, but they didn't scare her. And she even saw Goofy in the parade later, but he didn't scare her then. Now, my daughter has pretty solid intuition about people, so I wonder if maybe there was something off about the cast member beneath the mask. I know Disney has an intense vetting process, especially for cast members who interact with the public, and honestly, every person we've ever interacted with there has just been lovely, but I do have to worry about that particular cast member. I mean, he could have murdered a hitchhiker that morning for all we knew. Zoe's reaction to Goofy reminds me of when we went to the Magic Kingdom with some friends of ours from New Hampshire. These kids were from a really rural area with a home in the woods, and one of them, let's call her Lizzie, had some sensory issues, so her mother and I spent weeks before the big trip preparing her for what to expect. We troubleshooted in every troubleshot. We were careful and looked at every possible scenario so she would have the most magical Disney experience. Everything was going well until we were in Frontierland and the country bears came out on the street to socialize. I love the country bears, so I got excited and said, "Look, Lizzie, bears!" The poor kid let out the longest ear splitting scream. "Ah!" And she took off screaming through the crowd. It took some effort to catch her and even more effort to calm her down. It took a really long time. I had forgotten that where she lived, bears were a real menace, and that not that long ago a bear had tried to break into her family's home. It smelled food on the other side of the wall and tore off the siding of their house and made a racket trying to break in. So, after all those weeks of meticulous planning, I ruined everything with three little words: "Look, Lizzie, bears!" The poor kid was hyper vigilant all day, scanning the crowds for bears and refusing to go on most of the rides. I still can't see those stupid bears without hearing her screams. Speaking of traumatized children, I didn't just ruin Disney for my own friends. I once upset a stranger's child by squirting her in the face with icy water. Okay, I had nothing but good intentions. We were in a long line and it was sweltering hot, and I had one of those misting bottles with me. I'd filled it with ice beforehand, so it was really refreshing. This little girl watched me spritz my face a few times, and I thought she looked hot and tired, so I asked if she wanted me to spritz her too. She nodded, so I kindly aimed the nozzle at her face and squeezed the trigger. Unfortunately, the water came out in a solid stream, and the girl started sputtering. Her mother whirled on me. "Did you spray my child?" I quickly explained that her daughter had asked me to. The child stared at me like she hadn't just given me permission. "No, I didn't." I reminded her that yes, she did, but she just denied it. Now, either that kid was a liar or she hadn't really understood my question, and maybe she only nodded to be polite. I apologized as well as I could, but it was a long, long, awkward wait in line behind that angry child and her mother. Now, I'm not the only member of my family to have offended someone waiting in line. A few years ago, we were waiting for Peter Pan's flight, which is the best line because you walk through the Darling family's home and Tinkerbell flits around, sprinkling pixie dust everywhere. But there is this one tight corner in the line where everyone is kind of wedged in there and there isn't much to look at. We'd been stuck in that spot for about 5 minutes, and my son's tummy was starting to feel upset. He'd been eating junk food and drinking soda all day, so that wasn't a surprise. It was a surprise, however, when he let out an enormous, juicy fart that reverberated through the line. Everyone behind him got crop dusted, and not with pixie dust. People started gagging and waving their hands in front of their faces. I have never smelled anything so bad. It smelled like a baby bird flew up his butt and died in there. My husband and I started arguing about what to do. We'd already waited in that line for 40 minutes and estimated we only had about 15 minutes left to go. I wanted to leave and take our son to the bathroom to check his pants, and my husband wanted to tough it out because we only had a few more minutes. I could see the poor people behind us listening, and they were all trying so hard to be polite, but it was clear they wanted us to leave. Silas let out another fart that somehow hit the woman behind him full in the face. Her mouth had been open when he farted, and her eyes filled up with tears, and she began sputtering and retching. So I grabbed my son and made for the nearest exit. My husband and daughter could have still gone on the ride, but they were embarrassed and left right after we did. My son kept farting. It was almost time for closing anyway, so we decided to cut our losses and go home. It usually takes us about an hour, but unfortunately, there were a couple of accidents on I-4, so we spent the next 2.5 hours in traffic, choking and gasping and cursing our miserable existence. By the time we got home, we couldn't get away from each other fast enough. Well, on that note, I am going to leave you. Please let me know any of your Disney adventures or misadventures that you'd like to share. And you can just leave them in the comments below, and I really look forward to reading them. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Rachel Makes It Weird.